So I woke up this morning, unfortunately, and it came to my attention that MatPat had made another video full of historical inaccuracies. Now, it's been a while, so I'll introduce myself. I'm SnapJelly. I practice historical swordsmanship. I'm a historical reenactor, and I have choreographed and been in stage fights, both on stage and on TV. And I have a whole YouTube channel right here that is primarily dedicated to historical fights as they are portrayed on TV and in video games, and myths and debunking, the whole shebang. Now, I have once prior made a video on MatPat's game theory a couple years back when he made a video about For Honor, which was just beautifully horrible. So I started watching this video not really expecting that much, but honestly, I will say that it is, from what I've seen, I haven't watched all of it yet, but what I've seen, it is a lot better than the previous video. There are, however, still some things that I feel like I want to say, which is why I'm making this video. Now, if I sound a bit irritated in this video, that is because I am. Honestly, I'm not going to beat around the bush. I'm just going to say it as it is. I am slightly annoyed, and that's not specifically MatPat's fault. So I'm not saying that, but just honestly, it is kind of upsetting to me that once again a channel with such a big influence is spreading myths and myth conceptions. And here we go. Like in the beginning of his video, he says this:
Game Theory, the show that dual wields science and logic.
Like he uses science and logic. Right, now here's the thing. It is clear from this video that MatPat has no experience practicing martial arts, or specifically weapons-based martial arts. So I would have preferred it if you used science and experience. Right, you might say that I'm nitpicking here, but like using logic is an argument that people make when they have stupid arguments, or when they don't have arguments at all. Like, you can do this, it's just logic. Well, no, you can't. If you have no experience practicing martial arts, then what do you have to base your logic on? That's my question, right? And sadly, MatPat is a person who says that he does research a lot, and nobody fact checks him. And it's just a fact that if you repeat something often enough, people will believe it, no matter how stupid it is. So MatPat repeats a lot that he does a lot of research, and people believe him, and his fans defend him with that as an argument, saying, oh, he does research, I'm sure he knows what he's talking about. Well, listen, if his research was so accurate, he wouldn't have so many people debunking him, now would he? Like, he might do a lot of research, but once again, if you have no experience practicing what you're researching, then how do you know that what you're reading is actually factual? How would you know? Because that's something that, like, HEMA people and historical enthusiasts do, specifically. Because even historical sources might not be accurate. And that's something that we do. We read it, we try it out, we practice it, we figure it out. This works, this doesn't work. Like, what might have happened? And I can just see that this video, once again, leaves a lot to be desired. So, let's just get into it and see what I have to say.
What he lacks for in vocal support, Eivor more than makes up for in physical support. Eivor is unquestionably the strongest assassin that we've ever seen appear throughout this series. Throughout this game, Eivor will be dual wielding anything that he can get his hands on. And I do mean anything he gets his hands on, including things like shields. This announcement was enough to get the internet in a tizzy, with headline after headline about this. And so that is what I told Ubisoft that I wanted to talk about in today's sponsored episode. The trope of dual wielding in games. It is super cool, but does it actually make sense?
I would talk about if it actually makes sense, but I already did it in a separate video. So you can just watch that if you want.
Like, just because you can do something, does it mean that you should? What is the history of dual wielding? Did anyone ever dual wield the way that we're seeing Eivor do in the game? And is there a world, any world in existence, where using two shields would make sense? Cause, I don't know, just wanna know. So let's start with some historical context, shall we? For those who aren't familiar, dual wielding is when you use two weapons, one in each hand. And initially this seems like it should be a great idea, right? Not only do you look doubly cool on the battlefield, battlefield, but you're also doubling your offensive capabilities, right? Wrong. Think about it. You can only really be offensive with one arm, one weapon, or one side of your body at a time, which means that even if you are equally effective at using a weapon on both sides of your body, which already is going to be taking a lot of training, half the time that part of your body is just going to be rendered useless, or at least less effective. It's not an efficient strategy.
Wait. Hang on. Alright, so he says that you can only be offensive with one side at a time. Alright, imagine a boxer using only his right hand. That's silly, right? Yeah, well, in this instance it's the same. When you talk about fighting, now dual wielding is something that it has happened in the past. It hasn't happened a lot, because in most cases it is just not as effective as you might think. But the idea that you, like, one half of your body is less effective, or you can only be offensive with one side, that is not true. Like, the whole strength of dual wielding is using both your weapons together. Now, you might not be using them the exact same, but let me just grab some swords. Alright, excuse the rust, please. During the Ronas, I've gotten a bit lazy. But having two weapons, using two weapons at the same time, the strength of having two weapons at the same time is that you can parry and attack with both. Right? So you might not be using them the same. Yes, you would have one arm primarily forward, right? Like a boxer would only jab with his left if he's right-handed. But that's because his right hand is the power hand. Right, so I would have one sword forward probably. I could use that to parry, and I can thrust with the other one at the same time. So why would one or the other be less effective than the other one? How does that make sense? Why, if I have my right arm forward, why is this one less effective? I'm using it for different things.
And in a battle for your life, efficiency matters. To boil it all down simply, battles are all about a balance of offense and defense, coming up with solid defenses until it's the right time to strike. Which is why, throughout history, something used for offense, like an axe or a sword, is so often paired with something focused more around defense, like any of a variety of different shield types.
Well, yeah, like, okay, the reason... You're kind of looking at it from like a video game perspective again, like something offensive as a sword. I mean, well, yeah, your sword is used for attacking. Like, you would probably not use your shield for attacking. You might be like shield bash somebody, but that's not as effective as like media wants you to believe. Like, primarily your shield is going to be a defensive tool, and primarily your weapon, your sword or your axe or whatever, is going to be an offensive tool, right? But you can still parry with your sword. So... the reason that, single-handed weapons are paired with shields is because you need something to protect yourself. And having a large wooden board in front of you offers better protection than, not having a large wooden board in front of you. So you'll find that in time, when armor gets more developed and more prevalent on the battlefield, that shields slowly started, well, they never completely disappeared, but people started using them less. And they became smaller simply because they had more protection than other parts of their body. Like, or in some cases, people didn't use shields at all, even while they were not completely covered in armor, just because they used very tight formations. Like, essentially, what's required on a battlefield or just as a fighter is for you to have a solid defense, like whatever it is, because you have to keep in mind that you cannot be hit ever. That's a difference between like weapon-based martial arts and other kinds of martial arts, is that you, in a sword fight, cannot be hit at all, because the chances of you surviving if you get hit are tiny. Like, a very small wound somewhere on your torso can be lethal. Even if you get like a slight cut somewhere in your arms or your legs, if it cuts an artery, you'll probably just bleed out. And even if you manage to amputate it and like burn it or whatever that works, that might still get infected and then you would still die. So it is absolutely essential that you do not get hit at all, right? Now, very tight formations can work that way very well. Like, you might not be able to protect yourself very accurately, but you have people around you and next to you that are covering for you, so you're still essentially safe. right? The idea of using a shield is basically just a very large covering. It just covers a large part of your body.
However, that's not to say that there's no historical evidence of dual wielding. Quite the contrary, in fact. If you only have a one-handed weapon, your other arm is entirely useless.
Wait, nope. If you only have one weapon, your other hand is entirely useless. That is about as wrong as you can possibly get. And this is the thing that I saw that made me want to make this video. Wrestling is so unbelievably prevalent in history, and it's completely ignored by media. Yet that is the thing that pretty much every soldier would know, at least to a slight extent. We know that children learned wrestling before they started practicing weapons-based martial arts. Wrestling is everywhere in historical manuals. I can just grab one and open it, and it will probably open on some sort of wrestling. There's all kinds of wrestling. There's just naked wrestling. There's wrestling with knives, wrestling with swords, wrestling with pole arms. There's wrestling in armor. Wrestling is an enormous part of historical combat. It's unbelievably important. People have been wrestling for thousands of years. So the idea that your offhand is useless is as far from the truth as you can get. In fact, I would argue that in many instances, personally, I would actually choose to have a bare hand as opposed to a second weapon. Because if you're not careful with your second weapon, TV doesn't always show dual wielding in a very good light. Like they show them swinging around, opening themselves up very widely, and then you can get stabbed everywhere, crossing their swords. You might actually cut yourself if you're not careful. You could do this, right? Now, in many instances, personally, like take axes as an example. I would not choose to use two axes. If I had no shield and I had just an axe and I find a different axe, I would not pick it up. Because the benefit of me having a bare hand is much more useful than the benefit of me having a second axe, right? I can use this one axe to block pretty effectively because they're not so heavy that they're difficult to move. You have to be able to move them agilely for them to be effective as a weapon. So I can use this one axe to block, and the ability for me to run in and use my other hand to grapple and to be able to subdue an opponent is far more valuable than a second axe would be. To me. Perhaps other people might disagree, but wrestling is a huge part of historical combat, and it should absolutely not be ignored.
And in most cases, nearly anything is better than just your fist. Heck, even something as simple as a stick is going to provide better defense and longer offensive reach than just your arm. And
again, you're thinking in video games terms, mate. Like, longer range, sure, but this completely depends on the stick. Because some types of wood are absolutely horrible for any kind of fighting, right? I'm not a wood expert, I don't know, but there's plenty of sticks that if you whack somebody in the head with it, it would just break and not do anything. Right? If you get like a solid oak stick branch or whatever, then you can actually use that to defend sword blows. It will not cut through very easily. But you have to know how to do it, you have to be fast enough. Good luck with that. So, that would get some defensive capabilities, but again, some range. That's the question. Do you want extra range? I don't know. It depends on the situation. Like, if my opponent has a knife, then I would definitely want to stay away from that person, considering I don't have a knife myself or anything else. And I can grab a stick, I can use that to create some distance. That would be great. If my opponent doesn't have a knife, then I might choose to not grab a stick, because once again, I would prefer to tackle him and take it to the ground and start wrestling. Because that would be better, that would be more useful to me than a stick, probably, because I feel more confident in my ability to get this guy in a chokehold than I would be to grab a random stick off the floor and see if that works. Because if this is not a good stick, and he gets closer to me, it's foolish to assume that you can subdue him with one blow with just a random stick that you find on the floor. So, in video game terms, grabbing a stick might give you 2 extra attack points, so it would be better than your bare hands. In real life, it doesn't work like that.
And this is largely what you see with the history of dual wielding. Most of the time, the technique was used for one-on-one duels with 2 different weapons.
Funny, he's showing the exact thing that I just said, remember? Like, blocking with one hand and stabbing with the other.
a longer sword for attacking, and a short sword or dagger for defense. In fact, defensive daggers became so popular that the parrying dagger was designed with defense in mind, sporting advanced knuckle guards and cross guards. Turning our attention eastward, the Japanese in the medieval era used shields far more sparingly than their European counterparts. An emphasis on horse archery combined with the unique benefits of the Japanese armor made handheld shields more of a hindrance to the movement than a defensive boost.
What are the unique benefits of Japanese armor? Is that what he said? Wait, let me go back. Unique benefits of Japanese armor. What exactly are the unique benefits of Japanese armor? Let me ask you. Like, what's unique about Japanese armor? And I'm talking about real Japanese armor, right? Not the idea leather, bamboo, kind of super flexible, lightweight armor that you can kick flip secretly into the daimyo's bedroom without making a sound and assassinate him and ride your skateboard off into the sunset without being noticed. Like, no, not that kind of armor. Real samurai armor that's made of steel. What's unique about it? Generally, Japanese armor is lighter than European armor, generally. But there's also very heavy Japanese armor. Also, generally, Japanese armor covers less of the body than European armor, but you can compare it to a European with a similar amount of armor, and that would, of course, even the playing field. Because if you look at the armor that he shows, you can have a European, like a pikeman, with a sallet or a cattle hat, perhaps spolders or baldrins and a breastplate, and it would be pretty similar in terms of protection right there. Like, there is not a lot of difference between weight or mobility or protective ability of Japanese armor versus European armor. That's really just a myth portrayed by, TV. The Japanese stuff is mystical and magical and amazing. Like, armor is not that complicated. I mean, it's complex, but it's not complicated. What armor needs to do is it needs to protect you without limiting your mobility. And like, the not limiting mobility is key. If your armor limits your mobility, that means it limits your ability to fight, which renders the armor useless. And armor does weigh you down because it's metal, it's heavy. You have to get used to it specifically, but it's more like you get tired faster, not really you get actively slower when you wear it. Also, the idea that Japanese people didn't use shields, they kind of did, but differently. Like, I'm pretty sure that I've heard the Metatron say before that the Japanese did use shields prior to the era of the samurai, but I'm paraphrasing, that might be wrong, I'm not sure, honestly. But when you consider, like, the very large shoulder blades that the Japanese had on some of their samurai armor, some of their earlier samurai armor, which in a way functioned as shields, considering how you wear them. If you bend over, they protect you very similar to how a handheld shield would do. And also, samurai very often had wider helmets, which in a sense, similar to a European cattle hat, I suppose. It does protect you from strikes from above, your neck area and stuff like that. So those are shields, in a sense. Different in a way, but they're still shields. And the Japanese also used pavis shields. I'm pretty sure that they did. They might call them differently, but essentially just a big shield that you put down on the floor, right? So, they didn't use shields. The reason that Japanese didn't use handheld shields the way that you imagine is because they were archers and polearm users primarily. Halberdiers, if you will, like yari, naginata, and whatnot. If you look at the European halberdier or pikeman, or something like that, they're also not going to carry a shield because they need two hands on their weapon. And that's simply it. Now, if you're a knight on a horse with a lance, then even if you have full armor, you might still carry a shield, right? So it's really just necessity. Right, there you go.
Combined with the unique benefits of the Japanese armor made handheld shields more of a hindrance to the movement than a defensive boost.
Oh, wait, hang on. Wait. I'm lingering on this bit quite a long time. I haven't watched this far into the video, but how does a handheld shield? There's an alarm going off. I hope you can't hear that. How is a handheld shield a hindrance to your movement? How? Why would it be a hindrance to your movement? It's not. I mean, well, you have to move differently. with it, of course, but you have to move differently with any weapon that you want to use. So using a sword and a shield is going to be different than using just a sword. It's different combination of weapons, different effective movement.
It was during this time period that the samurai began carrying two different swords, the longer katana for battle and the shorter wakizashi for ritual purposes.
I'm pretty sure wakizashi is not just for ritual purposes. He might not have meant that, he might have misspoke a little bit, but a wakizashi is just a shorter weapon as well. It's like I'm also pretty sure that they started with the tanto before carrying a katana and a wakizashi necessarily, but like a wakizashi is a shorter weapon that you can use more comfortably in more enclosed spaces. Essentially, it is definitely a weapon. It's you have to consider it being a weapon. Like carrying a longer sword on your hip at all times can be really inconvenient, especially when you go inside and whatnot. And I don't know the Japanese customs of carrying weapons inside places, but I can imagine that they would have preferred to leave their longer weapon at the door and keep their shorter weapon at their side should they go inside for self-protection purposes.
However, some sword masters developed a two-sword fighting system using both of these blades. One of Japan's most famous swordsmen, Miyamoto Musashi, developed Nito Ichi, a school of swordsmanship that loosely translates to two swords as one. Similar to European dueling, Nito Ichi utilizes the smaller wakizashi as a defensive weapon and the longer katana as the primary.
Alright, again, it's not exactly wrong, but he's kind of making a lot of assumptions here. Comparing it, for example, to rapier and dagger, like it is a recurring thing. What you see with dual wielding is that you want one weapon with a longer reach and one weapon with a shorter reach. That's true. And you could make the argument that the weapon with shorter reach is primarily more of a defensive tool. But like I said, the advantage of having two weapons as opposed to a rapier and a buckler, for example, is that you have two weapons that you can attack and defend with. And, excuse me, a wakizashi is not that much shorter than a katana. The idea that the wakizashi would be a defensive thing and the katana would be an offensive thing, that's just kind of not how it works. That would that neglects the whole benefit of using two weapons in the first place. That's what I mean.
So dual wielding has some historical precedent, but so far the emphasis has been on one defensive weapon and one offensive weapon. What about what we see in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, where we see Eivor dual wielding two very similar looking axes? And quick side note here, yes, they are clearly different. One is bigger and heavier and would function as the defensive axe, while the other is lighter and probably meant to be the main attacking axe.
Alright, he says a bunch of stuff very fast here, and I am not going to let him get away with it. I'm not going to skip over it. He says that he uses one heavy axe, probably as the defensive axe, and one lighter axe, most likely as the offensive axe. Why would the heavy weapon be the defensive weapon? Why? Because if there's one thing that an axe does is give a big, great old wallop and split someone's head in two. That's what an axe wants, alright? That's what an axe is for. So a heavier axe is going to deliver a heavier blow. And an axe does not have a lot of defensive ability, alright? There's nothing protecting your hands, it's kind of just a stick. You have to move it around fast in order to be able to defend yourself accurately, and you have to be accurate with it too to protect your own hand, because if somebody slices you on the hand, you're screwed. Then you have to move it accurately in order to be able to block with the stick portion and not with your hand on accident, right? So you have all the reason to use the light one as the primary defensive weapon, and the heavy one is the primary offensive weapon. The heavier one is going to give you a heavier punch. And when we talk about heavy weapons, there's no difference in kilos, right? Weapons are not nearly as heavy as people imagine. I've made a video about that, you can watch that. So when you're talking about a light weapon, it's maybe like 1.1 kilos, and a heavy one would be like 1.8 kilos. That's quite a large difference. It's going to feel quite different, but it's not effectively going to slow you down. The difference in it is that the heavier weapon obviously gives a heavier blow, and it's also going to tire your arm faster. That's the difference. That's what a heavy weapon does.
Differences between the two isn't likely to be significant enough to change our overall discussion on fighting strategy using two axes, so that's what I'm going to talk about right now. Well, when it comes to dual wielding two of the same type of weapon, the Dimakairi class of Roman gladiator were specifically trained to use two curved scimitars called sikai, but this was entirely for the purpose of spectacle rather than tactical advantage.
Right, I agree. I will sort of put a little emphasis on that. Gladiators were, although they were trained very well, were very strong, very in-shape people, gladiator fights were not nearly as bloody and deadly as people imagine, as people want. It was spectacle, it was sport, right? And gladiators were expensive. So most of the time, gladiator bouts did not end in death. Except some rare instances where it was specifically ordered for a fight to end in death. They were celebrities, right? It's not to say that they were not necessarily good fighters, but the fighting styles, especially if you go to like the later, if you go later in time, people wanted more spectacle and weirder things. The fighting styles are not necessarily reminiscent of something effective. It's more for show.
Then there's Thailand's Krabi Krabong, which has a form called Dab Song Mue, which uses two swords, but in my research I wasn't able to find any historical examples of dual-wielding axes specifically.
I can't say anything about that martial art that you just talked about, but I can say that there are definite examples of people dual-wielding axes in the sagas.